Hello and welcome to Memoir of Matriarch with me, Louise. My guest today is Rob Henderson, academic, writer, including of a very successful Substack, and of a new book called Troubled, a Memoir of Foster Care, Family and Social Class. We spoke about whether sexual liberation counts as a luxury belief, why so many elites tend to talk the talk on the 60s, but actually walk the walk on the 50s in terms of having much more conservative private lives than they let on in public. And in the extended part of the episode, we spoke about the gender gap in politics and why women seem to be moving so suddenly to the left. That extended version of the episode can be found at louiseperry.substack.com, where, as always, you can also find the back catalogue of extended episodes, the bonus episodes I do with my husband, and also the MMM chat community. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions, which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Rob, why do you think it is that advocating on behalf of children, the won't someone think of the children kind of Mrs. Lovejoy thing, is right-coded?
Yeah, it's become kind of a meme, right? Like anyone who says that this will have uh, detrimental effects on kids, won't stop thinking of the children. It's become this punchline, this meme. Why is it right-coded? I think it became associated in people's minds with finger wagging church ladies, religious people, Christians, just kind of these obnoxious moralists. And at some point, I don't know when this crossover happened. I mean, the whole sort of cultural transformation began maybe early 1960s, but I mean, by the 1980s, if you look at pop culture, it's pretty clear that if there's an authority figure like a principal or a teacher or anyone who says that they, like the Dead Poet Society, that kind of movie where kids need discipline, you need to like look out for kids and not just let them roam freely and do what they want, that became this right-coded meme, this conservative meme. And I think there's a lot of educated people are terrified of being thought in those terms. And I think that actually goes a long way to explaining a question I've had for a long time is why won't universities penalize students for acting out, for disrupting class or interrupting events or locking themselves in the university president's office, going to these extreme lengths. And they're hardly ever penalized for it. And I think like these boomer professors, they came of age at a time when, don't trust anyone under 30, kids know better than adults. And now they don't want to be thought of as the man. They don't want to be thought of as an authority figure. And so as a result of this kind of selfishness of adults and their own precious reputations and self-image, those concerns have superseded important guardrails for young children.
Yeah, I think that's yes. So the church ladies thing, and I guess also the adult autonomy thing. I mean, unfortunately, adult autonomy, as is evident many times in your book, runs right up against the safety and comfort and psychological security of children again and again. And so if you think that if you think that throwing over bourgeois social norms in favor of freedom is an important goal, then it's hard to avoid hurting children.
It's sort of intertwined with this one strand of liberalism of pure selfish autonomy, of not needing anyone else, of everyone is self-sufficient and we just need to get out of everyone else's way and you, do your thing. And maybe that can work for functional adults, self-sufficient adults, but children aren't adults, and children require guidance and parenting and caretaking and role models and all of those things. And yeah, somewhere along the way, I think we forgot about that.
Do you think that sexual liberation is a luxury belief
um,
for
is
straight
sexual
people?
liber
Let's say,
yeah.
just to narrow it
Yeah,
down.
right. Yeah. I mean, gay people can do whatever they want. I mean, there's no, I would never, yeah. Let's say, okay, so is it a luxury belief, sexual liberation? I mean, I guess I do have this kind of libertarian impulse in me. I understand it that when adults, they should be able to do what they want. But the problem is, like in the aggregate, once that becomes introduced and normalized and even promoted, of if it feels good, do it. Naturally, there are going to be unplanned pregnancies, and inevitably, there are going to be children born into less than optimal circumstances. And I think we've seen this over the last few decades. Like a thought experiment I like to give to people is, imagine you enter a time machine and go back to like 1946, and you tell people, the US or the UK, whatever, just, in the next couple of decades, they're going to, there's going to be a pill you can take. Women aren't going to get pregnant unless, if they don't take, if they take this pill, they're not going to get pregnant. And even if they do, in the ensuing decades, abortion is going to be more and more accessible. And I know there's the whole Roe v. Wade thing going on in the U.S., but broadly speaking, it's abortion is still far more accessible today than in 1946. And so you ask these people, okay, there's going to be these reproductive technologies. Will there be more unplanned children being born or fewer? Will there be more kids in foster care and orphanages or fewer? Are there going to be more kids born to unmarried parents or fewer? And I think, most people in 1946 are going to say, like, that sounds like magic. That sounds like a miracle. We're never going to have like yeah, every parent is going to have this incredible power they can exert over when to have kids or not. And instead, what has happened is basically the opposite of what you would predict. And so, in a way, I think these reproductive technologies sort of facilitated sexual liberation. It introduced this idea that you can have sex without consequences. And in a way, we're actually seeing the consequences despite, or maybe even because of liberation and how that's intertwined with abortion and with the birth control pill and everything else. So, yeah, I mean, is it a luxury belief? I gave it a very narrow definition. Maybe especially when I was writing the initial essays around luxury beliefs, I was still in my PhD program. I still had this very sort of academic mindset, and so I gave it this narrow definition. And now the concept has kind of taken on a life of its own, and people apply it to like everything. Like, oh, this guy bought a Lexus. That's a luxury belief, which is not
I
what
was
it
going to
is.
ask as well, like,
But
what are the most
yeah,
annoying ways in which people
yeah.
misuse your idea? Because I've definitely seen it
What? Yeah,
misused.
I see it too. And I
Yeah.
get it. Like, what you introduce something and people, modify it and do their own thing with it. But the narrow definition I gave it, this kind of academic definition, is ideas and opinions that confer status on the elites while inflicting costs on the lower classes. And so if it meets those two categories, then it's a luxury belief. And notice the definition doesn't say anything about intent, whether it's deliberate or conscious or calculated, like, oh, he's holding this belief in order to raise his status. I don't say that's why. I'm just saying, does it raise the person's status, regardless of what's ever going on inside their mind? And does it have disproportionate costs on lower classes? And so sexual liberation, yeah, of course. Okay, so championing sexual freedom does confer status on the upper class, the elites, the educated, and yes, it does actually have disproportionate detrimental effects for the lower classes. Um, so, by that narrow definition, it would have to be a luxury belief.
There we go. There we go. I think it's, I mean, a more narrow example that I used in my book referring to the idea of luxury beliefs was to do with promoting the sex industry, the sex workers' work kind of view. But I mean, it was just kind of complicated, right? Because
Hmm.
when you hear people, members of the upper classes, saying that sex workers work and promoting it in that sense, they are normally doing it it does raise their status, right? At least in a lot of elite circles, it does. They're often doing it in a very self-conscious way, as in that they're actually trying. They think that they are promoting the interests of the vulnerable, they think that they are actually championing the poor. They're also raising their own status kind of because they're doing that. I mean, there's like an interesting sort of Christian thing going on there, right, where it's seen as very, very commendable to champion the poor, but not necessarily. There's kind of a disconnect between what you might think as a member of the upper class helps the poor and what actually does.
Well, if you're a member of the upper class, you have an obligation, I think, to really like give it a thorough analysis and don't just, oh, it makes me feel good, and at a superficial level, it seems like it would help the poor, and that's good enough. You shouldn't rely on good feelings and warm and fuzzies to decide whether something's going to help the poor or not. Like, actually look at the data, maybe have a few conversations with people who live in impoverished communities and ask them what they think. But instead, it's just like, oh, let me talk to a few academics and journalists and sociologists and people who claim to represent or speak on behalf of those groups, and that's good enough. I mean, it's a very kind of lazy way of thinking. It's that's like one of the things I've been, by now I'm used to it, but one of the things I was surprised by when I first started interacting with lots of educated people when I was 25, 26 years old, so I'd been an adult for a little while, was just, the kind of laziness and lack of clarity in people's thinking despite having gone to college. Like, I went my whole life thinking, oh, people who go to college are smart, because I went to a place where people didn't go. And I had, I'd watch TV shows, and like, I'd watch like House or whatever TV show of highly educated, smart people. And that was my image of what an educated person was. And I discovered now they're like, most of them are pretty, I don't want to say they're dumb, but they're not as smart as you would predict.
Midwits.
Midwits, sure, yeah.
I mean, it's a very useful expression because the midwits are super, super sensitive to social status. That's often what's going on, right, with people parroting silly things at places like Yale and Cambridge. That it's status seeking rather than truth seeking.
Yeah, I mean, that's people want to look good to their peers, and I think like weirdly, the higher up you go, the more that concern prevails. I've shared surveys online indicating that the higher up you go in educational attainment, the more likely people are to agree that they're afraid of revealing their social and political views at work for fear of being fired or fear of spoiling future employment opportunities. And it's just fascinating, like, because you would expect the opposite. You would expect that as people get more educated and more occupational prestige and resources and all the things, they would be more open to speaking their minds because they have sort of less in the way of material concerns. But as you go up the ladder, you actually have more in the way of sort of social concerns, connections, and need for status. Like, the psychological concept of need for status is actually positively correlated with education and earnings. And yeah, a lot of the sort of social psychology around this is fascinating too.
Yeah, it is that kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? But I guess also as you kind of go up the education hierarchy, you encounter more and more people who are extremely ambitious and sort of super sensitive to gradations in social status and so on, and so all that kind of stuff becomes, and also indeed in your original luxury beliefs formulation. Luxury beliefs are often actually more expensive than our luxury goods and harder to come by than whatever. What was your original example? Like a Canada Goose jacket or something like that?
Canada Goose jackets.
Right.
Yeah, those are those are gauche now, because you can find a Canada Goose jacket at a secondhand store for like, $150 or something. But in 2015, when I arrived on campus for the first time, I looked those up. It was like, $900 for like the basic model of the Canada Goose jacket, but they ranged, I think, all the way up to like $2,000. But yeah, the luxury beliefs, I mean, they're more expensive because they take longer to learn. I've been challenged on this point too. I mean, there have been a couple of interesting essays sort of challenging the idea. I think, the critiques are interesting, but I think the basic idea still holds up. But one of the critiques is something like, luxury beliefs, they're not equivalent to luxury goods because they're just words, right? And you can reproduce the word, and that's not nearly as costly or expensive as, showing a Rolex on your wrist or something. And it's true that they're just words, but you have to be able to communicate them in the right way, in the right order, express it in a specific way. You have to learn the vocabulary, the terminology, when to say it and when not to, and keeping up with it takes a lot of effort and a lot of work too. And so, I sort of analogize it to, I've cited Pierre Bourdieu, the sociologist from the 1970s. He wrote Distinction: A Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste, but he wrote about how the elites in Europe in the mid 20th century, one of the they had to learn about wine and art and furniture and exotic locales, and elites still have to learn about those things. But if you ask someone, what wine do you like, and they tell you, and then you ask them why, they have to be able to communicate and use the language of wine in order to indicate how sophisticated they are. And in the same way with luxury beliefs, if you ask someone, what they think about the police, they can say, I want to defund the police, but then you have to ask them why. And if they just say, oh, because cops suck, that's not enough. They have to say, oh, because we need to redirect resources to social workers and violence interrupters. And there's been a history of brutality and blah, blah. They have to be able to communicate it in a sophisticated way, indicating that they went to an expensive college or they consume the right media and they work the kind of job where they can listen to the right people and they move in the right circles. So it's not just the belief, defund the police, but also why do you believe it, and can you communicate it in the right way? Can you express yourself as a member of the educated class? And you can't just do that from watching a couple of YouTube videos or something. You have to kind of be immersed in it for most of your waking hours.
Yeah, that's true. Yes, and it's not just expensive in the sense that buying college tuition, particularly in America, is expensive. It's also expensive in terms of the opportunity cost. You've spent your time doing this, and also you've spent your time around people who've done this. And that's also an indicative of your own status and so on. So yeah, and you can't keep up this right. I mean, theoretically, I suppose you could, if you just had enough money for an internet connection, you could spend all day reading The Guardian and whatever, and maybe like social justice Twitter and get the hang of it. But it would be quite difficult. I think that you need more immersive study.
Yeah.
I mean, I say this kind of conscious of the fact that I'm basically a member of the counter elite, right? Like I am fluent in this stuff, which is one of the reasons that I'm able to write against it, because I've kind of come through the other side of reading Foucault at university and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, you have to be. I mean, counter elites they're kind of exiles from the establishment in a way. I mean, that's sort of historically how things go. At least, if you read people like Peter Turchin, and this is, it's, and then you get accused. Like I've been accused of hypocrisy or saying, well, you're criticizing elites, but you went to the elite schools and blah, blah. And it's like, the reason why I can issue critiques that upset them is because I spent a lot of time around them, right? Like if I was still enlisted or if I was still washing dishes for minimum wage, like they wouldn't listen, and my critiques wouldn't land. They wouldn't even respond to me, right? They will only respond to people who they categorize as someone worth responding to. And the only way you can join that category is if you have credentials or wealth or power and so on. And so it's like if you're not a member of that class, they'll just ignore you, and then if you join it, they'll call you a hypocrite. And so there's always these kind of defenses, no matter which way you go. Like no matter who you are, if you express a critique, they'll find a way to make the next move on the chessboard and say, oh, actually, here's why your critique is invalid, because you're a hypocrite.
And also one of the reasons why we hear so little from kids who've grown up in care or kids who've grown up poor, that there are just so few who end up, you're so rare, I mean, as you know, right, in having had that kind of background and then ending up with a PhD from super elite universities. Like definitionally, no one would know about this perspective if you hadn't reached the level you have and had the ability to write about it and have become a massive success of a book. So yeah, we just basically don't hear from these kids, or you occasionally hear from these kids. I mean, I always find it interesting talking to some people that I know in my kind of upper middle class professional circles who do certain jobs that put them in contact with the general public. So doctors is one example, some kind of lawyers, like criminal lawyers, some like police officers, some people that I know well who interact with the general public tend to have really different politics from the people I know who don't interact with the general public. I don't know if you've noticed the same thing. Academics obviously don't interact with the public at all.
Yeah, I've heard this, when I speak to my journalist friends, like the older ones, who still have some memories of the bygone era of like shoe leather reporting, where they'll tell me, back in the day when journalists would actually sort of interview ordinary people, or they would cover the crime beat, or they wouldn't just sort of scroll Twitter and decide what to write about based on posts they're seeing, but actually go out into the public, that they would often hold sort of more moderate political views, or even in some cases more conservative views. But sort of the further you get from reality, the more your ideas become sort of based on abstract ideals and not what's going on in sort of base reality. I had this professor in undergrad who liked to say common sense is like air. The higher you go, the thinner it gets. And there's something to that,
Yeah.
that, like if you've spent your whole life in safe, low crime, high wealth, highly educated people, you've never actually met someone of, who isn't on their way to university, or who's on a way to kind of blue collar jobs, or, um, you've spent your whole life raised by two married parents, and all of your friends have been raised in that way. And you've never met someone who hasn't been raised in poverty or dysfunction, or in a high crime area. And, your model of reality gets skewed by like whatever journalists are telling you in the media, or whatever sort of pop culture you're consuming. And I think that's why, like in the preface of my book, I write how I've met quite a few affluent people who've attempted to imagine, they put in the effort to imagine what it would be like to be poor, because there's this, poverty and inequality that's a sort of perennial topic among the chattering class. So they've tried to imagine what it's like to be poor. But family is under discussed, and I've never met any affluent person who's ever tried to imagine what it would be like to grow up without their family, without being raised by two married parents in that kind of safe and stable family system. And that's like, that's very that for kids who are raised in poverty, that's anomalous to be raised by two married parents. Like, there's just this vast class divergence that I write about at length in the book. And all the discussions around material poverty, it's important, but I think we assign it a bit too much importance, and we don't focus enough on all of the other sort of social and cultural factors that are causing families to continue to deteriorate.
I have an old friend who I met at university who had a similar trajectory to you in some ways, and having spent some time, she spent some time in care, and ended up going to university just because she was very smart and conscientious, and had some good luck. And when she came to visit my family, she said this was the first time she'd ever encountered married parents who'd been together for 30 years or whatever it was at that point. And yeah, and I mean, I was like 19 at the time, and that was very surprising to me. But yeah, the difference in family structure is, I mean, what is that line about the upper middle classes talk the 60s and walk the 50s?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, all these
I mean, I borrow that
statistics,
line a lot.
right? And all these statistics
Mm.
about divorce, whatever it is, a third of marriages end in divorce. That's not true if you went to university. It's so much lower.
Yeah, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who was telling me, he said, he has, he's a graduate, all his friends have university degrees, and they've been married, all of them, for a few years. And they were sitting around and saying, like, there's a few of us, we've all been married. How come none of us have divorced yet? The divorce rate is something like 40%. How come none of us have gotten divorced? And my friend was like, oh, well, that's because we all went to university. And like statistically, for us, the divorce rate is something like, in the ballpark of like 10%, not 40%. People hear that snapshot statistic of 40% and don't realize like that's actually concentrated among sort of lower middle and below. And then unmarried parenting is definitely, almost entirely concentrated among sort of lower middle class, working class, and poor. I mean, that point about marriage is interesting about your friend. I remember this was a story I was going to, I think I initially put it in the book, and then eventually I left it on the cutting room floor. Was I had this friend Christian who was raised by a single mom, and he and his mom were, they were always, especially like once we sort of hit puberty, they were always getting in the shouting matches. And she had like a new boyfriend every other week, it seemed. And one night when we were 13, him and his mom got into it, and she said something to him like, if you don't want to live here, get the hell out of here. And this was like, I don't know, midnight or something. So he walks out. He thinks he's this tough 13-year-old kid. He's like, oh, fine, I don't need to live here. I'll find my own way. He's 13, and he realizes he has nowhere to go. And out of all of our friend group, there were 6 of us in this sort of friend group that we had. He called me. And at that time, I was living with my mom and Shelly, who was her partner at the time. And she was the only one who had like a stable, they weren't legally married, but they were like in a committed partnership. And my friend called me and he stayed with us. And I remember like he woke us up in the middle of the night and I had to wake my mom and Shelly up. And they asked him like, what's going on? And he told them how him and his mom had gotten in an argument. And my mom and Shelly asked him, basically said, you can stay with us, but we'll have to call your mom and let her know where you are. And she has a right to know and all those things. And, I think at the time I wasn't thinking this way. At the time I just thought, oh, it's cool. My friend can stay with us for a couple of weeks. But now the reason he called me, I'm pretty sure, is because I was the only one who had two parents and not just one. And, or if I had one, it wasn't like, with like, fleeting, I didn't have like a parent who had like a cycle of rotating relationships with different people. He felt safe with us. And when you have two married parents who trust one another, that sort of social capital spills out and kids can sense it. Even if they can't verbalize it, even if they don't know it, they can feel when two adults love one another and trust one another and can create a space for other kids to feel that too. And so if you sort of expand that out to the level of a neighborhood full of married parents, kids are just going to feel like far more secure in their everyday existence than a kid who lives in sort of social instability of living with a single parent who's working, who's distracted or neglectful, and other people who have like a cycle of marriages and divorces and other kinds of alternate family structures. And a lot of people don't think about that. They just think like, oh, married parents versus unmarried parents, but they don't understand that it's not just the kids of the parents who benefit, but it's like kids throughout that neighborhood who also receive kind of benefits from the spillover effects of that.
One of the really devastating lines, I can't remember if it was this friend or another friend at the time, that you write about, is when you told a friend of yours, in a fairly conservative place, that your mum was now dating a woman. And he replied, "You're really lucky because that means you're not going to have like stepfathers parading through your life, basically." And this was a boy who'd been sexually abused by a stepfather. And that's
Yeah.
like
It wasn't even his stepfather. It was just some boyfriend
some
of his
guy.
mom.
Yeah.
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 And yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Katie Faust, I don't know if you know her, she came on the podcast a little while ago and spoke about, I mean, she's someone who absolutely puts children at the center of her politics in a way that is considered, widely considered to be very low status and weird and right wing. But anyway, she said, if you're ever in doubt about the malign effect that family breakdown has on children, just try Googling my stepfather and see what Google suggests.
Yeah.
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 And I did it.
It's and
And
it's oh yeah.
and top results are things like my stepfather makes me uncomfortable, my stepfather's touching me, all this kind of stuff, or
I
stepdad
mean,
or
a lot of
whatever.
that. I mean, it's horror. Yeah, and like a lot of the women too who choose those kind of guys, they themselves are survivors of sexual abuse,
Yeah.
and it's yeah. I mean, it's funny. Like at the individual level, like any given stepfather is statistically likely to be a very just going to be a fine person, whatever, going to be okay. But in the aggregate, right? Like there's been study after study showing like stepmothers too. I mean, if you compare stepmothers to biological mothers, stepmothers are, orders of magnitude more likely to abuse their kids. It's just going to be sort of far less because men are more abusive in general anyway. But if you compare stepfathers to biological fathers, it's like shoots through the roof in terms of the risk, in the aggregate on children. And we're now, I think, 2 to 3 generations into this. And it's like very unfashionable to talk about that this is probably having some non-trivial effect on kids, on people's mental health issues. A lot of concentration right now on smartphones and social media and technology, and I'm sure that plays an important role in what's happening with young people with Zoomers. But I can't help but wonder, you know, now Zoomers are being raised by people who themselves were raised by single parents, and it's become normalized. I think it's one thing if you're a single parent and you were raised by two married parents, at least you have that template in your mind of like what family stability looks like, and you probably carry it forward in some ways, even unconsciously, the way you raise your own child. But if you're a single parent who's only been raised by a single parent, all you've known is that kind of dysfunction and chaos and neglect. You don't even have a template in your mind for what family stability might look like. You can pass that forward. And I'm not saying every single, they're not all going to be like, but like statistically, it's going to be an increased likelihood that this is going to be passed on in some way. And yeah, this has got to have some effect. But it's probably not going to be a popular research topic for anyone.
Yeah, and it's hard because obviously there are situations where leaving an abusive partner or whatever is the right choice, and so it's hard to say and will be better for the children on balance. And so it's hard to condemn this phenomenon without seeming to condemn those cases. I mean, basically, what we want to say, right, and this is what's really difficult to do in sort of at the population level, is what we want to say is people should like try their best to stay with the biological parent of their children, and they should only leave if they have a really good reason. But the problem is that how we define a really good reason is difficult, and you end up with this slippage where if everyone's kind of, I mean, I get the impression from reading your memoir that a lot of the adults are just like, they just encounter someone else. Like the idea that you should try and stay with the person you're with just doesn't seem to be taken very seriously. And people just encounter someone else and they're like, oh, yeah, okay. And so you have this rotating cast of characters in children's lives. And that just seems, I guess that just seems to be really normal. And so, why would you put up with any level of dissatisfaction if you don't have to?
Especially when everyone around you is doing it. There's no sort of convention upheld, no principle around long-term commitment, and yeah, it's kind of this collective action problem. And yeah, I mean, I had 5 close friends growing up, and none of us were raised by both of our birth parents, and it was kind of the norm in the neighborhood or the town to be this way. And it's funny, like a lot of people, especially sort of more people on the right, will attribute this to, they like to point to behavioral genetics. They like to point to, oh, these are just sort of innate propensities. Some people just aren't inclined to long-term commitments, low conscientiousness, whatever. But if you look at the patterns throughout the past several decades, this can't like, social norms obviously play a role. I mean, I've cited work from Robert Putnam and Charles Murray and others that if you just look at white Americans, like you see this massive shift in terms of married parenting and unmarried. You see it in the UK too. The UK and Wales. I've shared these posts on Twitter or X. The share of children being born to unmarried parents. It hovered on the order of around 5% up until around 1960. This is the UK and Wales, and then it skyrocketed, and now it's 40 to 50%.
Yeah.
Same in the US as well. And I think about like my own adoptive family. So on my mom's side, this isn't in the book. I was going to work, these are sort of outtakes. My grandparents on my mom's side, they, see that my grandfather proposed to my grandmother. He was like 21, she was 18. This must have been in like the early 1950s or something. And yeah, she said yes. The caveat was he had to stop smoking, stop drinking, and stop gambling. And which is like unthinkable today for a proposal. A 21-year-old man and an 18-year-old woman, like that interaction would ever occur is hilarious to think about. But my grandfather agreed. They got married. They had 3 kids, and they adopted my mom. So they had 4 kids in total, and they were married for 60 plus years before they both passed. They had 4 kids, so there are 3 biological kids. All 3 of them got married. All 3 of them got divorced. And their kids, who are my cousins, born in the 1980s, they all grew up and had kids, but none of them got married to their baby mamas, right? Like they just had kids out of wedlock. Now those kids, they were born in the early 2000s, so they're Zoomers, like teenagers, some of them, early 20s, and they're just like not in a good place. Like they have a lot of sort of behavioral issues, attention issues, just a lot of anxiety. They're just like clearly this is not just a matter of personality or behavioral genetics or anything else. Like these are they're responding to changes in the culture too. And no doubt if my grandparents had been born in 2001, like they would have have been married for 60 years, right? Like they would be like my cousins are now, or I guess my nieces and nephews. Yeah.
I mean, what space do you think there is for behavioral genetics in understanding this? Because it's probably going to be a bit of both, right? I mean, what we know about, I wanted to ask you this, right, about, because in some ways that's a sort of, that's the academic elephant in the room in your memoir, right? The fact that you could have come from such a difficult background and have ended up being so successful. Anyone who knows about the kind of nature nurture research is going to be thinking about that. I mean, how do you How do you think about that now? It clearly is the case that social norms have a massive role to play, because look at what's happened since the 60s. But how much of a role? What do you think?
I mean, it plays a huge role, of course, but it depends on what you're looking at. So if you're looking at things like educational attainment, occupational achievement, earnings, those kinds of things, then like, yeah, intelligence, conscientiousness, impulse control, all those kinds of things are going to play a role. And intelligence isn't especially modifiable. It doesn't really respond to incentives that well. Like you can't just sort of reward and penalize a kid and in an attempt to turn him into a baby Einstein or something. It's just not going to work. But incentives and environmental constraints do affect personality traits like conscientiousness. Like you can get a kid to behave in a more sort of obedient way, with more patience, more punctuality, more integrity and respect, by rewarding certain behaviors and penalizing others. People mistakenly think that heritability means like it's unchangeable.
Mm.
Like height and intelligence are highly heritable, and they're not very modifiable with environmental inputs, at least in sort of developed first world countries. But personality is highly heritable too, but that is much more responsive to culture, to norms, to constraints, and those kinds of things. Like you can behave extroverted even if you're introverted, right? Like yes, your introversion is highly heritable, but you can expand the way that you behave in a way that you can't with intelligence. So all that being said, I know that people read my book, people have read some of the things I've written, and they say, oh, well, it's because you were smart, you became successful. And I think a lot of people who they overvalue or sort of overlearn from behavioral genetics and forget that intelligence or academic ability is necessary but not sufficient to do well in school. So, I try to be honest in my book that, like obviously the raw ingredients were there, but like like especially in the foster homes, it was just not at all cultivated. And so, I saw this thing on Twitter earlier. There's some academic program people are talking about how, it can get a 2-year-old to read at a second grade level. And I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, I was literally the reverse. I was in second grade reading at a 2-year-old level because I was in the foster homes. No one was reading to me. I barely knew the alphabet. And so even though I was able, like clearly the potential was there, but if there aren't adults around to recognize it, to cultivate it, to whatever, like enroll a kid in special classes or provide the right materials to allow that potential to express itself, then it's just not going to go anywhere. And so, yeah, I was doing all the same things my friends were doing. I had a chip on my shoulder based on the way that adults around me were behaving. And, I had this line in the book about how if adults let you down often enough, eventually kids learn to let themselves down. And I was just like this angry kid and had this rebellious streak, maybe disagreeableness, where if an adult or a teacher wanted me to do something, my instinctive reaction was to just resist it. And so by the time I graduated high school, I had a 2.2 GPA, and that clearly was not indicative.
Translate that for Brits. Is that good or bad?
Oh, right. That's like like barely passing,
Okay.
essentially. Like the bare minimum threshold, like whatever the boundary is, I was like right there.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, it's necessary but not sufficient. And it wasn't until I was in an environment where I was around adults that I respected. So after I enlisted, left for the military, and was in a place where I could indulge my interests and so on, that all of that stuff, and I still had, it still took 8 years in the Air Force before I was able to finally recognize that that's what I wanted to do and that's what I wanted to be. If I had gone to college at age 17, right out of high school, I probably would have failed out, despite, again, like being academically inclined, much more so than my friends who I graduated with. I was the only one who read for pleasure and who would read the textbooks and practice the math exercises and those kinds of things. But behaviorally uh, and in terms of the way like I approached the world and approached authority figures, yeah, I wouldn't have been able to go to Yale because I would have just been angry at everyone, or I would have I just wouldn't have put in the effort necessary. And so, yeah, you need to have all of the things in place, the norms, the adults, the role models, good parenting, in order for a smart kid to actually reveal that intelligence.
Yeah, so genetics is maybe representing like a ceiling, but in order to get anywhere close to it, you need all this other nurture stuff, and some kids come anywhere close to getting there. Another kind of spicy hereditarian question, but it's the fact that this question is difficult to ask frustrates me, because I think it's actually such an important one in thinking about the luxury beliefs thesis.
Mm-hmm.
To some extent, right, the elite selects for not just high intelligence, but high conscientiousness. There are personality traits which are selected for in terms of getting into the best universities and the best career paths and whatever. And people who don't have those traits are likely to cluster at the bottom of society. I'm thinking about something like being low conscientious. Do you think that one of the reasons why luxury beliefs are so destructive is because something like drugs, right? Like decriminalizing and normalizing the use of drugs is just much, much more likely to mess up your life if you're low in conscientiousness and have other kinds of traits which we know cluster at the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy? Is that kind of the hidden hereditary thing that's going on in terms of why luxury beliefs can be so destructive?
So regardless of the reasons, so I think, like, yes, on the right they would lean more towards sort of the hereditarian view. They would say the reason why luxury beliefs are destructive for people at the bottom is because whatever, like intrinsically they're less conscientious, have difficulty with impulse control, and so on. And then on the left, they would probably attribute it to lack of resources, that they don't have enough access to education, or they don't have enough in the way of money or income. But yeah, I mean, I think actually both of those are true to some extent. But I'm pretty well versed in behavioral genetics, and I think that's an important part. I think a lot of people on the right take it a bit too far. Again, like with the personality versus IQ question. But yeah, I think generally, if you're intelligent and if you're conscientious, you can more or less figure it out. Especially assuming that you yourself are surrounded by other highly intelligent, highly conscientious people, there's not going to be much in the way of avenues for self-destruction. And so you can sort of dabble in alternate lifestyles. You can dabble in drugs. You can whatever, like abolish the police in your gated community, and nothing's going to happen to you.
Yes.
But even if you put someone like that, even if you put a highly intelligent, highly conscientious person in the kind of neighborhood that I was in, I am highly conscientious. I've never taken an IQ test, but I probably would score pretty well on it. And you put me in an environment like Rebel, I'm doing the same thing everyone else is doing, especially
Yeah.
with the lack of oversight, lack of parenting, lack of everything. I'm like, a teenage boy is a teenage boy. And like, if there are drugs and girls and, cars and everything, like, you're going to find a way to have fun, thrill seeking, and all those kinds of things. And if there are no good role models or parents or other smart people and conscientious people around to show you a different way of life, then you're going to fall into those same patterns too. So I think it's not entirely just like your own conscientiousness and intelligence, but also the those attributes in the people around you as well. Those also matter. And so yeah, the kind of the lower on those traits you are, the more important cultural guardrails become to prevent you from self-destructing. And in a way, the highly intelligent and highly conscientious people, they've remade society in their own image with their own preferences, because they think, well, I don't need those guardrails, I don't need these norms, like I'm doing fine. Like why would we need these things? Like, my kids are fine, I'm fine, everyone I grew up around, they're doing just, and so then they just remake policy and culture and center the discourse around this idea that we just need to discard all of these oppressive conventions.
Yeah, so I mean, because the flip side of your experience of being someone who's got kind of the genetic advantages but has terrible environment, right? And so leads you towards like bad behavior, drug taking, all this kind of stuff. The flip side of that is someone who doesn't have the genetic advantages but does have a great environment. And I think the thing that we want to be striving for, I think, as like an actually fair society, and this is where you can have actually quite a left-wing hereditarian conclusion, right? Someone like Paige Harden would promote this idea, right? Is that if you take someone who doesn't have genetic advantages but gives them marvelous environmental advantages, that will absolutely improve their life. Like, it is both. There'll be a ceiling. It's not like they're going to end up being a brain surgeon or something like that, but they're going to have a better life. And to some extent, what the ideology of the 60s has done is it's denied a lot of poor kids without those genetic advantages exactly that environment.
Yeah, although I mean, I've listened to some of Paige Harden stuff and some other left-wing hereditarians, and they, there's always this kind of materialist outlook where, okay, I mean, it's in a way, it's almost to me patronizing, because I grew up around these people, And the message I hear, and maybe I'm wrong, but my interpretation is always it's often something like, they're not very smart, they're not very punctual or conscientious, and they have difficulty with behaviors. So let's just give them some money. Let's just give them a UBI, and just, it's not fair that they're unable to succeed in a complex modern economy. They were born with a poor hand, a poor genetic hand. So let's just transfer some money over to them and just let them be. And I don't think that's like a solution here to a flourishing life. Like it's a solution to sort of keeping them alive, and to whatever, prevent them from starving or revolting or something. But it's not the way to live, I think, like a satisfying, self-sufficient life that you can take pride in. I think that actually, yeah, having good norms, like, what are the sources of meaning that people have? If you're intelligent and conscientious and whatever, like, you can derive meaning from having a creative job. You can derive meaning from an interesting hobby, or traveling, or writing, or art, or all these kinds of things. A bunch of sources of meaning available to you. But if you're poor and you aren't especially smart and you aren't especially attractive and you don't have a lot going for you in terms of your intrinsic attributes, you can still take pride in forming a healthy marriage, or having kids that you're taking care of, or going into work and having people rely on you and helping to sustain your community. There are all these other ways you can do that. But instead, yeah, I think the tastemakers, the elites, the people who sort of set the tone for the culture, they've forgotten that we can cultivate other sources of meaning for people besides just how much money you make and how smart you are and how many degrees you have. And this was kind of a point that I tried to make in my book with my friends who ended up in, less than optimal circumstances. I had two friends who went to prison. I had another friend, it was his younger brother, who was shot to death, but he was my friend too. And even if those boys hadn't gone to prison, if they had been raised in like the perfect environment with two parents in a gated community, all the money you can imagine and everything, I'm not entirely convinced they would have gone to college. Like, I just don't think that's who those guys were. But if they had been raised in an environment with different norms and values and priorities, I don't think they would have gone to prison. So I think there's a limit to how much we can raise the ceiling, but there is, there's more we can do to sort of raise the floor as far as how far down these kids drop.
So are you dead against UBI?
I think so. I mean, I think it's just, this kind of life support. It's almost like, to me, an abdication of responsibility, of just throwing money at the problem and forgetting about it. And, there's more to life than just like having enough money to buy Netflix and eat junk food or whatever. Like, there's other ways to, promote pride in the way that you live your life. And yeah, I think it's a real shame, this idea of just, oh well, they're dumb and they're lazy and whatever, so let's just give them some money. It's just not a I don't think it's a solution.
Yeah, just hook them up to virtual reality headsets or something and kind of,
And they're
yeah.
capable of work. I mean, I know these guys, like, yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
They're not like the most academically inclined, but I know that if they were in the right context with the right incentives in the right environment, like, they would go to work, they would do what they needed to do. But they're just like, there's so many temptations around you, if especially when you're like a 19-year-old guy, and all you have to do is like tap your phone 3 times and you can get weed and Uber Eats and Tinder and whatever. It's like, why would you go to work? And so it's not a I don't think it's just a matter of, lack of academic ability or impulse control or whatever. A lot of it is just like the environmental temptations are so strong.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's a little bit different for men and women, because I think that for men, the loss of manual work has been really devastating in countries like the UK and America, because either these jobs have just disappeared or they've been offshored. And that's really bad. So there just isn't that kind of masculine status you can get from doing like very hard work, like mining or something like that. Very dangerous and difficult, but also meaningful and a source of masculine status that just isn't really there anymore. And that's actually not the fault of anyone really. Well, it's kind of the fault of, I think that mass immigration is really bad for working class men in particular. So to some extent it's the fault of politicians, but a lot of it is just to do with technology, and there's not a lot you can do about that. I wonder if it's a bit different for women, in that the main decisions that can like really really mess up your life as a woman are sexual ones, like starting a relationship with a guy who's abusive, for instance, particularly doing that again and again, which is like a story you just come across so often, right? Women in really dire straits, or having a baby with the wrong guy, all that kind of stuff. And that's where I think maybe the sexual liberation has hurt poor women particularly.
Yeah, I had this conversation the other day with a journalist who asked me about. She asked me, speaking of spicy questions, she asked me if pro life is a luxury belief because it's mostly
uh,
poor women who might need abortions,
Interesting.
that kind of thing. And I
Yeah.
thought about it, and I still don't know. I've been thinking about it ever since. We had this conversation like a
Mm,
week ago, and I've been thinking about it ever since. And I still, because what my mind jumped to was not the story of like a poor woman who desperately needed an abortion but couldn't get one, and was forced against her will to give birth to a baby. I had the opposite in mind. Like I knew this girl in high school, and I knew her, whatever, the guy who knocked her up, where it was the opposite, where she slept with him a few times, and it was clearly one of these situations where she liked him much more than he liked her, and he was just using her for sex. She gets pregnant and tells him, and he was like, shrugs his shoulders and was like, whatever, get an abortion, I don't care, like, it's not my problem. And she was devastated by this because she didn't want to get an abortion. And I'm sure she herself had come from like a very troubled background with her family and whatever. And she slept with this guy who was kind of like a charming sociopath basically. And he was like, get an abortion, it's not my problem. And like mocked her and laughed at her and told her she was dumb for getting pregnant and all this stuff. And yeah, she was heartbroken by this. And I just don't know that in this case, like, if the abortion option and all these other factors hadn't been in play, if she would have made different decisions about who to sleep with, if he wouldn't have been like so appealing to her, or like all of the expectations around child rearing and marriage and all those things completely transformed once abortion and birth control entered the picture. Where if that had happened 70 years ago, he wouldn't have been able to mock her and laugh at her or whatever and tell her to get an abortion. That wouldn't have been an option for them, and that would have completely transformed the incentive structure over who she was willing to sleep with, and how many women he could convince to sleep with her. I read this article the other day from this guy who was, he was born, I think, in the 1940s, and he was talking about how in the 50s, when he was a teenager, he would like walk the streets of Chicago, and him and his teenage friends, they would like try to find prostitutes to have sex with, because middle class girls, ordinary, they wouldn't sleep with them because they were worried about getting pregnant. But once pregnancy went out the window, or like the worries about it, then yeah, you can have casual sex with whoever you want, and people inadvertently get pregnant. And so yeah, I think like those situations actually happen probably at least as much as the horror situation that pro-choicers imagine of. The horror situation they have in mind is, oh, some poor girl gets, is forced to give birth against her will. But I think a lot of cases women don't want to get the abortion, but they're with a guy who bullies them into doing it.
Yeah, I think that's true. And the difficulty, right, with what do you do? Like, what do you do now? I mean, I think that the normal position, right, aside from sort of more extremist pro-choice people, is to think that abortion is a bad, sad thing. You don't think it's a good thing for women to be going through. You don't think it's a good thing, like, full stop. Um, but the question is, what do you do now? Because yeah, like the ideal situation in that scenario you described is that she didn't have sex with him, and like how do we, and then none of that, then this conundrum never comes up. But how do we just how social norms are very complicated, and contraception and abortion is kind of a 1-2 punch, right, in terms of just destroying the old sexual norms. And how do you reconstruct them? That's actually really hard. Like if you just suddenly, if suddenly abortion was criminalized across the United States, what would happen overnight? I mean, maybe there would eventually be some degree of reconstruction. I'm guessing that middle class women would probably change how they behave sexually really pronto, because they'd get it. Although curiously, I asked this question at I went and spoke at a Catholic college in America last year, and I had dinner afterwards with some of the students, most of whom were young women, and there were some academics there as well. And one of the academics said that she had actually asked her female students this question, like, what would happen if we suddenly got rid of the pill and abortion overnight? How would it change the sexual culture on your campus? And the girls said there'd be a lot more rape. That was
More
their
rape?
first answer.
Why would
Yeah.
what? Why?
Well,
What's the logic there? Yeah.
I think I know the odd answer, but I think what they're saying, which is actually really dark, is that actually um, women would not want to have sex in those circumstances. Like, women are only willing to have sex with the expectation that pregnancy will not result,
Okay.
and the men wouldn't take no for an answer. And one of the things I
What?
took right, well, one of the things I took from that is that these girls are having sex with men they don't trust.
That's exactly what I just. That was the first thought that came to mind. It's like
Yeah,
you're having a sex with a guy
you
who,
think would
without the
rape
pill, he would
you.
rape you. That's so.
Right,
That's
yeah,
real.
that's
But then
dark,
why are
right?
you? What? Like that just seems. Because then why would you sleep with him if that's the kind of guy you think he is? I mean, that's.
Yeah, well, that's the $1 million question, right? I mean, unfortunately, we look around and we see all the time that like men high in dark triad traits do not have any difficulty getting sex generally, which
I
is really
mean, I guess like
bleak.
we're more was rape like that much more common prior to the pill. I wonder because like I've like all the accounts I've read of like what it was like to be a young man in the 40s and 50s. It was mostly just like frustrated young guys trying to look for streetwalkers and prostitutes, and not so much like finding a girl in the neighborhood and pinning her down. Like I don't think that was. I mean, maybe it happened and people just swept it under the rug. Maybe it was one of those things that people didn't talk about, but yeah, that's sad that that's the kind of reputation that males have in the young female imagination of just a bunch of rapists who you need the pill because otherwise they would rape you.
Yeah, it's so bleak, isn't it? I mean, it's so hard to know about the like historical comparisons with rape because it's just the nature of reporting being so low and everything. You just don't really know. I suspect though that there's probably actually a lot more date rape now, just because it's more common to get into that situation where you're alone, and particularly if there's drugs and alcohol involved. Like there's because most date rape isn't the sort of it's I don't want to say that it's caused by confusion, that's not right, but it is provoked by ambiguity
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
to
yeah.
some
Right.
extent, and I think
Yeah,
if you've got more conditions of ambiguity, then it's going to happen more often. So that would be my
yeah. I
guess.
mean, especially when you have like alcohol and drugs in the mix and
Yeah,
young people
yeah.
who are naive and
This
yeah,
phenomenon where men tend to overestimate sexual interest from
yeah,
people they're interested in,
yeah,
and that effect is aggravated by alcohol. So they're more
yeah,
likely to see sexual desire when it isn't there.
yeah,
So
yeah. That
yeah,
is. I mean, that's grim, and it's yeah. I can't believe that that was the response. I
I
mean,
know,
that
disturbing,
doesn't
right? And
seem
this
right.
is a
Yeah.
question. I mean, it's like a difficult question for anyone pro life to answer.
Mm.
What actually would happen if we just got rid of
Yeah.
abortion and birth control? Would it?
I think it would be really ugly
I'm
for a few
yeah,
decades. It would take at least a
yeah.
generation of a lot of, I think, ugliness and yeah, babies being born and yeah, just like really as people adjust their behaviors and as the norms reconfigure themselves. Yeah, I mean, it
It
would
wouldn't
just
happen.
look
It wouldn't
yeah,
happen particularly quickly, though. I suspect.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's hard to know what the solution is, but I think yeah, there is more space for people to hold people to higher standards of behavior of like men and women, young men and women can, I think, exert a bit more care in terms of like who they're willing to sleep with and treating people with more respect than they do and all those things and but it's like right now at the individual level it's very hard to expect that out of people, especially young people, because the culture is going so much in the opposite direction of sort of fleeting pleasures and dating apps and sort of pursuing hedonism and yeah, people, role models and tastemakers and cultural elites aren't so willing to, suggest the opposite of upholding those conventions of, you know. And I get into these arguments with people about like, does it really matter? Do what the elites say really matter? And it's funny because like those same people think that what elites say matter when it comes to things like recycling or climate change or misogyny or homophobia or racism. Then if a prominent member of society who has a large platform, it does matter their opinion on those topics. um, and so it does seem like they are aware that elites do hold sort of disproportionate sway on culture and policy, on a variety of topics, but when it comes to marriage or other sort of conventional ideas, suddenly they take this sort of non-judgmental or even take the opposite stance of actually marriage is unimportant.
It's tremendously frustrating because I think it is the case, like, going back to this hereditary question, like it's both, it's nature and it's nurture. Like, it shouldn't be controversial to say so, but it's obviously both. And that also applies to the balance between material factors and ideology in terms of what drives history. Like it's both. And it's clearly possible for elite cultural opinion to change. It happens all the time. Historically, you see it happen all the time. And it could I mean, ours ought to. This is well overdue.
Yeah, I think there is like this awareness now among young. I think we had like a good 10 to 12, maybe 15 years. I mean, I'm thinking specifically sort of the rise of smartphones and dating apps where like yeah, from 2012 to like 2017 or 18, was like this novel, fun, interesting, exciting thing. And now I think a lot of young people are realizing its limitations um, and that's leading them to sort of question the broader um, phenomenon of complete sexual liberation and sort of absence of standards from sexual partners and what do you actually want in terms of a relationship. And I'm seeing like some small changes just but yeah, I think it's going to be like a generations long effort. I mean, it took generations to get to this point, so it's going to be generations before we sort of, I think, reel back some of the excesses.
Yeah, I got this question a lot when my book came out. Is there going to be a sort of backlash to all this sex positive stuff? And I think my answer then, and I think my answer still, is I think there's already a counter elite backlash, and there's already lots of women on university campuses who are foregoing the pill and are converting to Christianity, and that stuff's absolutely going on. But does that mean pornography is still out there? The pill is still out there. Like all this stuff is still out there. Does that mean that we're going to see this kind of mass change across society? Maybe what might happen is that you see it trickling down
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
it takes a long time, or I don't know. But I think it's really hard to put the genie back in the bottle when you've destroyed social norms, because social norms take a really long time to build up and they're really complicated. And I think when you trash them, it's not irreversible, but it's hard to reverse.
Yeah, that sounds right. That you have these kind of niche communities and people who are finding one another and realizing that there are other ways to live your life and approach dating and romance and relationships, and it doesn't have to be hookup culture or situationships or these very sort of short-term casual encounters. And yeah, but it'll take some time. And but yeah, I don't know. I think I'm kind of what short-term pessimistic, long-term optimistic. I think people will find a way, but yeah, it'll take some time. Yeah, I mean, I think also like what you're doing, kind of independent media platforms. There are other ways to get useful and true information besides kind of legacy media outlets and the kind of agenda that a lot of people who occupy those positions have. And you can find other ways to get you know information that's more suited to the kind of life you want.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.